thank you if you became a member or renewed your support during our summer member drive. Your gift allows us to bring you the news from across your state, the country, and around the world. There's still time to make your gift. michiganpublic.org/donate. From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta. Today, the latest on a fight over documents from the Michigan Economic Development Corporation that were seized by the Attorney General's office as part of a criminal investigation.
It's been kind of a long saga as they figured out what to do with this grant.
But first, the legal deadline for the legislature to pass a budget came and went yesterday, and the Democratic Senate and Republican House remain miles apart.
I think it's going to take quite some time to get a deal.
So, what happens next?
Simply because we've arrived at this point does not mean that we aren't continuing to engage.
But both the House and Senate have left Lansing for the week, and neither chamber is scheduled to be back at the Capitol for session until mid-July. So let's turn to Robert McCann. He is executive director of the K-12 Alliance, and before that, he was chief of staff to one then Democratic State Senator Gretchen Whitmer when she was a legislative leader. Bob, hi.
How are you?
Good. So what happened here?
Well, that is a very good question that I think a lot of people are scratching their heads trying to answer right now. Obviously the legislature gave themselves a deadline of July 1st several years ago to make sure that schools got budgets in time that they need to prepare for the upcoming school year. And yesterday, we saw them blow right through that, seemingly without much concern for the consequences of that. And so I think there's a lot of school superintendents, a lot of school board members, and frankly, a lot of parents and students just wondering, why is this allowed to continue to happen?
Bob, you're a legislative veteran. In a recently, maybe bygone era, there was a way to deal with these sorts of situations. It's in the rules. When there is a deadlock on a bill, it used to happen all the time with budgets, it goes to a conference committee, House and Senate members, Democrats, Republicans from each chamber. They reach a compromise. It goes to the floor for up or down votes, no amendments. From where you sit, would that have been useful here? One, and then why do you think that did not happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the budget as a 10-step process, we're still at like step 3, probably in that. And we're trying yesterday to jump from 3 to 10, which is not an easy thing to do. But because they didn't bother to have any urgency to do those steps you just described, it became the best case scenario yesterday, and they still couldn't get it done. And so, yeah, this process didn't just happen over the last 24 or 48 hours. This process and this failure has happened over the last 5-6 months now of delays and inaction and seemingly not caring about the urgency of getting a K through 12 budget done on time. So we should have been passing budgets back in April. We should have been disagreeing with each other and sending them to the conference committee so that they could start earnest negotiations. They could start formulating what would ultimately become a final budget so that as we were getting closer to that July 1 deadline, we had been making tangible steps along the way to get to an agreement. And instead, we were left with this chaos situation of trying to scramble something together before the deadline, and ultimately there wasn't the will or the way to make that happen. But again, it's really because of months and months of inaction.
So, Bob, from where you sit now, working with, advocating for schools, what does this delay mean?
It means schools continue to move forward in the summer months towards reopening without any budget certainty. To be clear, every school district in Michigan has already passed their budgets for the upcoming school year. By law, they have to. Their fiscal year starts yesterday. It starts on July 1. And so school boards and superintendents all sat down last month and passed what is a budget for them for the upcoming year. And normally, it's not uncommon that they don't have all of the answers in terms of what their funding is going to be, but they usually have a pretty good idea of where that funding is going to be. And so they can set a budget and come back and maybe make some minor tweaks to it in the fall. but it's usually a pretty good budget. This year they had to do it completely in the dark. And we've seen school districts passing budgets that make cuts, that pink slip employees, that dip heavily into their reserve funds that they aren't supposed to be touching, just to be able to make the most basic of hires, the most basic of decisions to be able to open their doors this fall. And so every day that this now continues into the summer, those are opportunities lost to come back and say, okay, we now have a little bit more certainty of where our budget is. Let's see if we can hire that extra reading coach. Let's see if we can hire that social worker that we had to let go. There is a tipping point, and we may have already reached it, in which those employees have found other jobs. So let's say the legislature comes back to us in August or September and says, here's your budget. Well, that's nice, but there's going to be dollars in that budget we can't spend anymore because you can't hire workers to start tomorrow. And so the consequences have already started, but the consequences are going to get worse and worse every day that goes by here.
Bob, you know Lansing. Where is Governor Whitmer in all of this?
I don't know. We know that there is a lot of talk about road funding, and that's been a common topic of her and seems to be a priority of hers. And we've seen attempts to link a road funding deal with K-12 funding deal. And the frustration in that for every educator in Michigan is, number one, where is the priority to get a public education budget done? But also, I don't know why you would need to link those two things together unless you were trying to raid one to pay for the other, meaning that their road funding plan that they'd been working on was contingent on pulling some money out of K-12 schools to make that happen. And so there's been just continued frustration over the lack of urgency from everybody involved, and that includes the governor, that includes the Republican Speaker of the House, and that includes the Senate Democratic leader. It's been an ongoing frustration for all of us as we've been left in the dark for months here, just wondering where is the priority for public schools, and it just hasn't been there from anybody involved.
What happens next? What are you going to be paying attention to?
I think it's imperative for all of us in the education community to continue to put the pressure onto the legislature here, and not just because they've missed a deadline and quite frankly, they're breaking the law right now by not having passed an education budget, but because our kids deserve better than this. Our kids deserve to know that their school district, their teachers, their superintendents, their school boards have had the summer months planning ahead for what's best for their education this year. And unfortunately, that isn't happening right now. We are left completely in the dark when it comes to what's going to be able to happen in many school districts as this budget stalemate goes on. And as it goes on further and further, the consequences that not only grow, but get much, much more severe for our kids. And we're hearing talk last night of this going into September or October. Well, schools are already open at that point. And if we are opening without funding, if we are opening, dipping into reserve funds with pink slipping employees, that's harming kids. And that shouldn't be what is allowed to happen here in Lansing, quite frankly. So we are going to continue to work with, obviously, our school superintendents, our teachers, our school board members, our parents, to really be speaking out and speaking directly to their legislators and say, enough is enough. We need to put all of the rest of this aside and focus on what's best for kids right now. And whether that's enough to make this work, I don't know, but that's a question better left to our leaders in the Capitol.
That is Robert McCann, Executive Director of the K-12 Alliance and Lansing legislative veteran. Bob, thanks so much for the time.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks for having me.
It was a jaw-dropping moment. The Michigan Attorney General's office executing search warrants at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and at a private residence in Farmington Hills.
It's all related to a very controversial $20 million state grant.
Rick, I caught up with the Detroit News' Beth LeBlanc with the latest from a fight in court over documents that were seized. Beth, hi.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Beth, first, give us the backstory of just what is at issue here over the $20 million grant that you and the Detroit News first reported.
Yeah, so in 2022, the legislature went on a little bit of a spending spree when it comes to earmarks, which are like very specific no-bid grants that they gave out. They gave out over $1 billion in these no-bid earmarks. And one of those that they gave out was to a woman named Faye Baydoun, who is a Governor Whitmer appointee to the MEDC. She's a donor. She's a fundraiser. She was high up in the Democratic Party at one point. And so we started looking into it, and we found that it was given to her for a nonprofit business accelerator that hadn't even been started yet. And so we started looking into it, and we started following her expenses, and there were some items that kind of raised some eyebrows in terms of the expenses that she reported to the MEDC: a $4,500 coffee maker, an $11,000 first-class ticket to Budapest, thousands of dollars in furniture. So we've been getting her expense reports as she's been spending some of this grant, and people have been concerned about what she's been spending it on. Namely, the biggest item is that she is giving herself a $550,000 salary as CEO of this nonprofit. It's been kind of a long saga as they figured out what to do with this grant and how to stop her funding.
And the saga then continues 2 weeks ago when the search warrant was executed. What happened?
Yeah, so on June 18th, the Attorney General's office served a search warrant at the MEDC's Lansing headquarters and at a private residence. They didn't say whose residence in Farmington Hills, but that is where Faye Baydoun lives, and it appears clear that it was her residence where they served it. So they went into the MEDC, they seized over 1,000 documents related to the MEDC's administration of this grant, and the MEDC was pretty shocked by that raid, and they are now pushing back in court, arguing that A, it wasn't necessary because they maintained that they were cooperating with the AG's office, and B, that when they came in and grabbed paperwork, that they took at least 3 bankers' boxes full of attorney-client privileged documents. Now, the AG denies all of that, says that, in fact, the MEDC had stonewalled their investigation and appeared to be trying to avoid giving them certain information about witnesses within the agency and documentation that hadn't been released yet. And they also argued that, look, if we did sweep up some privileged documents in what we seized, we have a team dedicated to kind of sort through that so that the investigative team doesn't see the privileged material. So that's what they were hashing out in court. And the judge told the AG's office, yeah, you can use your team called a taint team that they kind of sort through the privileged and non-privileged. And he said you can go through that and figure out what you can use in your investigation.
Beth, before we talk about what comes next in this investigation, let's just remember what the Michigan Economic Development Corporation is. What does it do?
Yeah, so the corporation is essentially the economic development arm of the state of Michigan. And it is a difficult thing to explain because it's what's called quasi-public, in that some of it is funded through corporations and then some of it is funded through state taxpayer dollars. And when those two things mix, there's a lot of gray area as to what is public, what is private, what is available to, journalists and what isn't. So it has always been a little bit controversial. I mean, I think it dates back to the Engler administration. It's always had a little bit of a question mark over how state taxpayer dollars are being used to drive economic development. But in recent years, it's come under intense scrutiny, in part because of these very large corporate incentives that are being flowed through the MEDC to very large corporations like Ford and GM and Goshen, and it's come under a lot of scrutiny for that.
Yeah, and then there's these legislative earmarks. They're a little different.
These legislative earmarks, these are a little bit different, a little bit lower dollar than the corporate incentives, and they are passed by the legislature in the budget, and then the governor signs them into law, and then the MEDC is just tasked with administering them, regardless of if the legislature made some oversights or mistakes while awarding that grant or didn't give clear instructions about how it should be used or what have you. And that's where some of the pushback from the MEDC has come on some of these grants, including the Baydoun grant, is that they've argued, look, we were saddled with this by the legislature. It's written into the budget that we have to be the ones to administer this. And there are only certain thresholds of inappropriate behavior where we can pull that money back. And that's kind of been the argument for all of this. The legislature is saying, stop giving the grant funding. And the MEDC is saying, the way you wrote the grant, we can't really stop it until they push certain buttons, like in terms of inappropriate behavior. So that's been, in terms of the Baydoux grant specifically, that's been the scrutiny that's been on them, is this question of, are they just a flow through for the money, or do they have the oversight authority to really say, hey, this shouldn't be spent on $4,500 coffee makers, let's cut it off. But the interesting part about this too is that the MEDC, throughout our coverage of this, has always said, this is the legislature that allocated it. We have no choice but to give it to Baydoux and to just administer it. But documentation that we obtained, and then documentation that the AG revealed in a recent filing, shows that people within the MEDC were talking to Baydoux about this grant as early as 2020, 2021. So they were aware that it was coming down the pipe. She says in some of these emails that the AG included that they had given approval for this. So there are some questions about whether it was the legislature alone that was instrumental in this grant.
So back to the documents that were seized by the Attorney General's office. As you noted, the judge ruled this week that this taint team can eventually go through the documents. What happens next?
So what happens next is there's going to be about a week where the MEDC can decide whether to appeal the judge's ruling. If they don't appeal, starting on July 11th, the Attorney General's office can deploy its taint team, which is a group of separate lawyers who go through the paperwork to determine what is privileged and what is non-privileged. And they go through that paperwork with an attorney from the MEDC. So they kind of reach a consensus of, okay, this is protected by attorney-client privilege. This isn't. This line, maybe in the whole document, is attorney-client privilege. The rest isn't. So that's what they'll be doing over the next several weeks. And then the AG's office obviously will proceed with its investigation. And we don't know when or if charges will come down in that respect.
Beth, finally, big picture here. Why does this matter?
Well, I think on two fronts. One is that over the past several years, the legislature has used these earmarks frequently and increasingly. And this kind of goes around the typical grant-making process, and it leads to really sloppy grants because they're pushing them into the budget the night before they pass the budget. Lawmakers have a few hours to read it, and then they have to vote on it. And so a lot of lawmakers don't know that these earmarks are in there because they're written in very obtuse language. So you can't really tell who they're going to, or they haven't had the time to do the research of who they're going to. And what we found in our reporting is that a lot of times they're going to campaign donors or for-profit companies, all sorts of things where you're kind of questioning, why is state taxpayer money going to this individual or this corporation? Now, they've tried to rein it in a little bit, but we'll see. I mean, with the budget pending right now, I guess when the rubber hits the road, we'll see how they do on that. The other element that's really interesting to me is that this is the AG's office, obviously, is led by Democratic Attorney General Dana Nessel. The MEDC is under the authority of Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And so when you see the AG serving a search warrant on one of Whitmer's cabinets, it raises some questions about how things are going in terms of the relationship between those two.
That's Beth LeBlanc, politics reporter at the Detroit News, who has been covering this story from the very beginning. Beth, thanks so much.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And that is It's Just Politics for today. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.